We're now going to move on to the sum ifs and counter ifs. These formulas work very much in the same way, but they simply allow us to enter more than one set of criteria. Again, the best way to demonstrate this formula's value is by jumping straight into an example. So I will start my formula with the equals and type sum ifs. Very important that you add the ifs on the end, else Excel will not interpret it in the correct manner. Now a quick note here, if you're paying close attention to the previous formula, the sum if, you would have noticed that the sum range was actually the last criteria. Here, for some reason, it has been switched around. So just be aware of that and don't allow it to trip you up. The parameters from here will be the sum range, which will only be evaluated once, and then we will have a criteria range followed by a criteria. If there's more than one criteria, there'll be a second criteria range and another criteria, and so on and so forth. You can add several hundred criteria into your sum ifs. Perhaps not entirely advisable, as your result would probably be quite hard to understand and the calculation speed of your workbook may be affected. But certainly 2, 3 or maybe even 4 criteria is reasonable to add into your sum ifs formula. In this example, we're looking for the value of desks sold by Kivell. So again, by value, we're referring to the total sales. But we want to filter our criteria by desk, type of item sold, and salesperson equal to Kivell. So let's start with the sum range. I'm going to click into the first cell of my column, hold Ctrl Shift, press down to get to the bottom of the column, and now I can press comma to move on to the next parameter. Now we need to stipulate the first criteria range. In this case, I'm focusing on the item sold column, where we want to check for desks. Again, I'll click on the first cell, hold Ctrl Shift, move to the bottom of the column, and now type comma to move on to the next parameter. Here we stipulate the actual criteria, the thing we are going to filter against. I'm going to open my speech marks, type desks, close the speech marks, I enter my comma, and I can move on to the next pair of criteria range and criteria. So the next thing we're going to test against is the sales rep. So I'm going to move into my sales rep column, choose the first cell, Control Shift down to the bottom of the column, and hit comma to move into my next criteria. Looking at the question, we can see we're interested in sales by Kivell. So I'm going to open my speech marks and type Kivell. Close speech marks. And from here, I'm ready to close my formula. As you can see, from each time I've added another criteria or another pair of criteria, the formula is expanded to give me more criteria options. You can see by the ... at the end there, it's an indication that we can keep adding more criteria. Each time another one is added, the possibility of adding more will be opened up. But from here, I'm happy that I have the right number of parameters. So I can just close my sum ifs and evaluate the formula by pressing enter. Let's just do a quick check on that formula. So here I'm going to use my filters and look for the sales rep Kivell. And then I'm going to look for items sold, desk. Let's add up all of those sales and we can see that it's 1,100. Let's remove those filters and we can see in effect we have 1,100. Next, let's move on to count ifs. Again, predictably, count ifs are going to be very similar to sum ifs, but they're going to perform a count rather than a sum. With this example, we're going to look at a different type of criteria, and that is greater than equal to type criteria. So I'm interested in number of pencils sold by Sorvino after a particular date. Let's put the formula together and see how we can reach that calculation. So first of all, I type my count ifs. Remember the very important S that allows us to do multiple criteria. From here, I just have criteria ranges and criteria. The count is just going to be performed directly onto the criteria range. So I'm interested in pencils, so let's look at the item sold column, type in the first cell, Control Shift down, and comma to move on to the next parameter. We're looking for pencils, so I'll just type in pencil. Comma to move on to my next pair of criteria. The next thing I'm interested in checking against is the date, the sales date column. So I'll click into the first cell of the column, Control Shift down, and hit comma to move on to the final parameter. So the next criteria I'm going to check against is the date, and I want to make sure that the sale date happened after the 1st of September 2010. To do that, I'm going to start my criteria, and again I am actually going to use quotes. From here I type greater than, and then type the date, 1st of September 2010. It is very important that that date be in the correct date format, else we're not going to get the correct answer out of the formula. While we're here, it might be worth discussing why I have put that criteria in speech marks. Speech marks are normally reserved for anything that involves text. In actuality, if I wanted to test anything that was exactly on that date, the 1st of November 2010, I could leave my criteria outside of speech marks because there's no comparative operation. There's no logical operator to be evaluated. I would just be simply saying where the date range equals 1st of September 2010. But where I add in that logical operator of greater than, I then need to give the criteria to Excel inside of speech marks. From here, let's move on to the final criteria pair. Lastly, I want to make sure that all sales are also performed by Solvino. So I'll type my comma to move on to the last pair. Pick my criteria range, which is of course the sales rep. Control Shift to the bottom of the list and hit comma. Finally, I can just type Solvino. Close my speech marks and close the brackets. Okay, so we've only got one result, but we have stipulated 3 criteria. So we're really narrowing down our list at this point. Let's just double check that that is in fact the correct answer. So first of all, let's start with the sales date. And we're looking for a date filter that is after the 1st of September 2010. From there, we also want to filter by any sales made by Solvino. And in fact, we see just one sale of a pencil by Solvino after the 1st of September 2010. So we can see our formula has evaluated correctly. It's a point worth noting that it doesn't matter in which order these criteria are applied. I could test first for the date, second for Solvino, and then lastly for pencil. As long as each of my tests are performed correctly, it doesn't matter what the order is. Another consideration with any SUMIF, COUNTIF, or AVERAGEIF formulas is that your ranges must always be the same size. So from here we can see that we have D2 to D49. So a range that is 48 rows long. Another consideration with the SUMIF, COUNTIF family of formulas is that our ranges must always be exactly the same size. So in this case, we have our first range of D2 to D49 is a range of cells 48 rows long. Again, from A2 to A49 is the same 48 rows long, and lastly B42 to B49. If these ranges are not the same size, you are liable to get errors in your formula. As we can see here, the formula has returned a value error. That is because it cannot compute every calculation against the column. If you imagine how we are testing against these criteria, we need all of the criteria to be available for all of the columns. If I have a result from this column, but at the same time not from this column, Excel cannot work out how to combine all these 3 tests. Ultimately, the thing to remember is that your ranges must always be the same size. I'm going to go ahead and fix that formula and put it back to A49. Hit enter, and we have our corrected formula back. Finally, we're going to look very quickly at how to use the AVERAGEIF and AVERAGEIFS formula. Effectively, these 2 formulas work very much in the same way as the SUMIFs and COUNTIFs, but simply give us an average instead of a sum or a count. Let's start with the AVERAGEIF to work out the average value of the sales made by Gil. Average ifs, open my brackets. First we need the criteria range, so again we're testing on sales rep. Control Shift down to the bottom, move on to my criteria parameter. In this case I'm looking for sales rep Gil. And then finally I'm looking at the average value of sales made by Gil, so I want that total sales column. From here I can just close my bracket and hit enter. Let's look at something slightly more complex, using two criteria in my average if. I need my extra s on the end because I'm stipulating multiple parameters. So here I'm looking for the number of pencils sold in the West. So I don't want the value of the pencils, I want the number of pencils. So I need to look at my units. Again, because I'm using an average ifs, the first criteria I need to fill in is the average range. That's the column that we're going to perform the calculation on. So here it's units. Click into the first cell of my column, Control Shift down, and move on to my next criteria. Here we're going to stipulate pencils. Move into my items sold column, Control Shift down, type my comma, and add pencil. Type a comma, and I'm ready to move on to my next pair of criteria. In this case it's going to be in the West. So I need to select my region column. Control Shift down, comma, and I can type West. Close my brackets and hit enter. Let's do a quick double check on that calculation. So first of all we are looking for pencils in the West, and if I highlight this column I can see that my average is 49.75. So far we've demonstrated the value of each of these formulas in turn and their various applications, how we can feed one criteria or multiple. But it's fairly rare in the real world that you'll only need to perform one of these formulas. People don't just want to know the number of desks sold by Kivell, they normally want to know how many items everybody sold everywhere. So in the next section we're going to see how we can use SUMIF formulas to produce a tabular summary, much like we would have done with a pivot table in the previous videos.